Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today, Jason and I. Just let's have an overview of how it's going to look like, the agenda for today. First, we will go through some trends in the industry and what we're seeing and some of the initiatives that are also being taken in regards, of course, of the cybersecurity. Then we will go through the activity groups that we are tracking and that we see, of course, targeting the electric sector. And then we will go actually specifically to look at each individual segment where we see like what type of activity from which group we see in each different segment and how they look like. And then we'll move towards the threat landscape. So we will see kind of three major type of intrusions and attacks that we're seeing, of course, in the field. So ransomware, supply chain, and of course the risk of internet exposed asset. And we will conclude with some recommendation on our side on how you can improve and harden your infrastructure. So I will now first start giving the mic to Jason, who will introduce you to the first topics. To you.
Awesome. Thank you, sir. So just to level set first, right? As we sort of go through some of these presentations, we don't always want to dive directly into the harder content, especially not knowing everyone's background on a webinar where we've got hundreds of people being able to see us live, and then the people are going to do re-recordings later. So want to really just start level setting on with regards to ICS, in case folks are new to ICS or new to the trends of not only the past couple of years, but really since the pandemic, the past year or so, seeing what we've already discussed over time being islanded industrial control systems, whether it be our DCS or at least islanding parts of our SCADA environments where we can, to over time seeing more and more connectivity. And that connectivity comes with its own business justifications, right? The digital transformation type of pieces that we've seen across grid operations, smart grid, it's all been for business cases. Obviously, in sort of the beginning of these conversations, being able to optimize what we're doing in operations, get real-time data, be able to then operate based off that data, and then also be able to send that back to the business to be able to start talking about things like fleet operations for generations, for example. And seeing that over time has now started to really blend itself into more of these edge cases of what do you do about introducing more cloud-based resources, or how it is that we have conversations about getting even more data out of operations into the corporate IT networks. And so this is one of the things that we've been not only seeing from a practitioner perspective, but that is, again, a practical business case that has been presenting itself. But oftentimes security sort of left in the lurch, right? Oftentimes you sort of talk about it after the fact. And that's becoming more and more of an increasing problem. And that problem statement is going to be one of the things that we'll talk about when Pasquale goes through discussions about threat activity groups in particular. But if you sort of see where we are right now on this trajectory of further connectivity, we're also in the past year in review able to discuss that this connectivity has led to further access attempts, whether it be from even just red teaming exercises, being able to demonstrate how you can go from corporate IT into your industrial control system networks, or from an adversary perspective, what it is that adversaries are going to be able to exploit with this additional connectivity. I'll go to the next slide, please. And so if no one's heard of the 100-day plan, so I've got news for you. There's been a lot of activity in the electric sector that's been sort of addressing some of these concerns. And having worked in the federal government across multiple roles, but the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, as well as the U.S. Department of Energy, I have to say that this is one of the things that really caught me off guard from the perspective of the first time I've seen an administration call out in particular OT and industrial control systems. In the past, even in legislation that led to things like NERC-CIP, there's always been this implied conversation about our industrial networks, but this was an actually sort of concerted effort to discuss OT and ICS in particular, meaning that we're now talking about technologies in that space that allow you to do further detection, that allow you to have that visibility across your networks, as opposed to maybe just IT-centric controls that we put in OT, sort of slapped it on there and hope that it all worked out, or just looking at our IT networks, because there was always this sort of discussion about, well, with regards to adversaries, they have to come in from somewhere. So maybe we just focus on these IT capabilities. And we saw that also sort of blend together with what things have happened in NERC-CIP over the past decade or so, but really now seeing this surge in a voluntary effort across utilities to address this 100-day plan. And in particular here, you can sort of see that as of the middle of August, a couple of months ago when Rob Lee was presenting in front of Congress on this, that we now have 150 electric utilities serving 90 million American electric customers, having adopted or committed to adopting the technologies that address that 100-day plan. So again, the idea that the threats that we're looking at are going to be based off of this further connectivity into our ICS, and that we know that electricity utilities are doing more than ever in this space is some of the positive notes, I would say, before we go into what are all those bad things that are happening out there, Pasquale?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. So now that we've set some ground, let's start over some of the activity groups that we are observing targeting the electric sector. But first, I wanted to let's define together what does for us define an activity group for us at Dragos. So first of all, we only track activity groups that are specifically targeting ICS or attempting to gain access to critical infrastructure. Just to give you a more concrete example, if simply sending a phishing email to utilities would not qualify for us, because this could be, let's say, an opportunistic campaign or another type of, let's say, financial motivated type of actor. So this would not qualify for us to make an activity group. However, the focus of the adversary to breach into ICS network or the success in doing so, of course, would rise to the level of activity that we consider worth tracking from our perspective. And the way we cluster activity is basically by using the diamond model that you can see here. And it's where basically we cluster based on those different features like victimology, capabilities, what type of infrastructure has been used, what are the capabilities of the tradecraft of a specific adversary. And here, just to make a distinction, activity group basically is tracking how it is done. So the tradecraft, which is easily mapped here, and this is the way we do at Dragos and some other companies do. And so this is why we may also see, for example, differently from tracking threat actor, which is usually mostly focusing on who did it, and it is more toward attribution. There is nothing wrong with that, of course, as long as it is consistent with your intelligence requirements. But the way we do at Dragos is with activity groups, and it's probably the easiest from our perspective in terms of accuracy. Because while a threat actor over a long period of time can become an umbrella term, we have seen this with different big groups that if you track them for 10 years, for example, mission change, people change, and basically over 10 years, they may have, let's say, targeted a variety of industries, which doesn't make much sense to you as an individual organization to defend yourself, because it wouldn't be so applicable. So we focus on activity groups, and of course, we do not speculate on the intent, on the identity of those IG and activity groups, and none, of course, should be implied by itself. Let's now see what are the group that, among the one we track about 15 publicly activity groups, and 11 of those we have observed targeting electric systems. However, only 2 of those 11, which are Electrum and Sinotyme, possess ICS-specific capabilities and tools to cause disruptive events. We will see some details a bit more in a bit. And so among those 11 groups that you can see here, 3 of those are, let's say, the new ones we have introduced publicly in 2020. So let's have a look at those and some of their characteristics. The first one is Telonite. Telonite, we learned first about them of the phishing campaign in 2019. And that activity actually impacted around at least 17 organizations that we know of. And the phishing was pretty targeted. They masquerade as legitimate entities, legitimate engineering bodies or certification bodies, and NERC. Here you can see this is a screenshot of sample phishing email they were sending. And the focus of the operation was mostly towards US electric utilities likely for initial access and information gathering. In their campaigns, Telonite leverages usually malicious documents and custom malware with multiple components, but also legitimate software that they use for malicious activity. And credit due, the first one to publish about the first campaign was Proofpoint in August 2019. And since 2019, we've been tracking Telonite. They started with lookback malware, and then 2020 they moved towards flow cloud malware. And now in first quarter of this year, actually, we have identified a new ICS targeting activity from Telonite. So it is a very active group. It is currently, however, not showing any indication of disrupting of damaging capabilities, nor the intent. So as of now, given the fact that they do not, let's say the capabilities do not extend to ICS disruptive, but definitely could enable lateral movement within the ICS network. One note, despite malicious code similarities with APT10 you may find in several reportings, Telonite, however, is not, Telonite activity group is not identical, is not a one-on-one match with APT10. The second group we introduced in 2020 is Sleepnight. Sleepnight has been observed to targeting specifically wind turbine companies that generate electric power in Azerbaijan. They launched multiple intrusions operations against the target from, let's say, late 2019 through all 2020. And they were leveraging spear phishing to drop a custom malware, which is known as PoetRat, a remote access toolkit. One interesting aspect of this group of Sleepnight is that victims share a unique technology with wind farms in Ukraine. And one possibility for specific victim targeting is that the adversary target the supplier maintainer of the wind farm itself, as the supplier, operator, and maintainer are all based in Ukraine. At this time, the extent of Sleepnight of the group interest is limited, however, to targeting wind generation in Azerbaijan. But of course, given the developed access and the stolen information like credentials, of course, Sleepnight tools and targeting focus could easily enable transition from stage 1 operation to stage 2 in the intrusion in the ICS kill chain. So moving from the IT network to the LTE environment. As I mentioned before, Sleepnight uses PoetRat, which is a remote access malware, and they use this type of. They've been using this malware in their operation to gather information. They were be able to take screenshot, transfer files, and execute command. And also in this case, it mirrors some of the observation we have seen in other activity groups. Where the ICS intentions exist, even though the capability itself has not yet manifested. Because as I said, at the moment, there is no indication of disrupting or damaging capability. And at Dragos, we actually track many threats earlier in the ICS cyber kill chain, because activity groups may cross over from the IT network to the T network, but it takes years, takes quite a while to do this transition. And last but not least, the third group is Kamasite, which has been we publicly report about in 2020, but we have been tracking this group internally since much longer. And this group actually is quite known because participated in multiple critical infrastructure intrusion events, including enabling the operations in 2015 and 2016 in Ukraine, in Ukraine power events. You may remember, of course, the second one in 2016, they enabled another activity group, Electrum, to perform the crash override, basically incident. And also there have been activity from Kamasite, also persistent campaigns targeting US energy companies, starting from late 2019 until mid 2020, from what we have observed. Also earlier this year, actually in August, based on some research and some findings from other organizations, we have also been able to identify a new sample of gray energy, which is a modular malware used by Kamasite, and is the successor of Black Energy 3, which is the earlier known malware used by them, and which was used gray energy to facilitate some prior intrusion against European electric facilities. And this interesting malware, definitely, it's made, it's 3 components. First is Mini. It's called the Gray Energy Mini, which is a kind of a packer that contains some anti-analysis techniques and drops the second dropper, which is the actual dropper, for which there are two variants. And this second dropper then drops the final vector that is used to get access to the system. It is, of course, possible to add, because of the modular nature of this malware, it is possible to add more ICS components to future gray energy variants. So even though we have not observed in the last year any disruptive operation by them, the fact that there is this continuous development, it's very important, and it should be, of course, taken as a concern and should make this group especially concerning given their past activities and the current activity in develop the toolkits, of course. Now let's go a bit more on what are the operational segments of the electric power sector. I don't know, I mean, I expect most of you probably are very much familiar on how the electric sector work, but just to give a quick overview to those who aren't, we can say, to simplify and give a generic overview, we can split the electric sector, the electric power infrastructure, into three segments. We have generation, transmission, and distribution. The electric power, of course, is generated somewhere like from sources like, you know, fossil fuel, nuclear power. Oh, sorry. Yeah, nuclear power and or renewable energies, for example. And of course, usually this is far from where the electricity is actually needed, far from the cities, because it's closer to the, let's say, natural resources they need to generate power. And therefore, the electricity is, of course, carried over the transmission lines across very long distances until the distribution substation, where it is, as the name suggests, distributed to the final customers. And along the line, the transmission distribution systems, there are like substation where transformers are used to step up or step down the voltage, of course, to provide the proper service for, you know, we may have cases of the industrial customers as well as the residential customers, which is, of course, different. And of course, each of these three segments has its characteristic peculiarities in terms of impact that can be done. I mean, successfully taking down a power generation, of course, will have a bigger impact than taking down a distribution utility. However, it's also different, and it is much difficult in terms of knowledge the attacker needs to have to reach this type of goals. So it's not definitely something easy that can be done easily. So now let's have a look quickly at let's say each individual segment and what type of group we have observed targeting each different segment. So with generation, like initially, of course, we have, as I said at the beginning, even though we haven't seen, I mean, the number of electric intrusion in the electric sector have increased, we haven't observed new groups demonstrating disruptive or destructive capabilities. Overall, at least, however, 5 groups have demonstrated the intent of the capability to infiltrate and disrupt electric power generation. And there is also a new interest in this in the electric sector, which has been shown by Xenotime. As I mentioned earlier, Xenotime is one of the 2 groups who has already in the past demonstrated the capability to access, operate, and conduct attacks against an industrial environment. We at Dragos assess that this group would be definitely capable of retooling and refocusing its disrupting effort on electric utilities, because they have already targeted the safety instrumented systems like Trigonex with the Trisis attack. And since 2018, Xenotime expanded to their interest to electric utilities, especially in North America and Asia Pacific regions. But also their target, they've been observed targeting oil and gas companies in Europe, US, Australia, and the Middle East. The other group that we've observed focusing on generation is Demalloy, who has demonstrated ability to access the OT network generation facilities, obtaining screenshots of sensitive ICS data, like a screenshot of HMI, human-machine interfaces. The third group I wanted to mention is Telonite, which is also targeted is also represents a threat to generation because shares quite some similarities in targeting and especially capabilities with Dimalloy. However, neither of those two groups, nor Dimalloy or Allanite, have demonstrated the ICS disruptive or destructive capabilities as of now. Their focus has been mostly in general reconnaissance. The fourth group is Wasonite, which has been actively targeting critical infrastructure in Asia, including nuclear power generations. And actually, they have successfully deployed malware in the administration system of at least nuclear power plant that we know of. This is, of course, pretty concerning, although there is no evidence of that would suggest, even in this case, that they have been successful in penetrating the operational network. So while this group has also yet to display any ICS-specific capability, there is definitely a strong, we have definitely strong data that indicate there is a sustained and continuous interest from Wasonite in this type of resources. So it's definitely interesting and a concern to keep in mind. And last but not least is Sleepnight. We already talked about this, has been specifically targeting the wind turbine companies in Azerbaijan. So as of now, activity groups targeting electric sector have not successfully disrupted power generation. All these activities, however, that we have observed could be used for espionage or to facilitate further disruptive activities, though.
And before we move on, just really quickly, we have some questions from the audience, and one that sort of piqued my mind was really this discussion now of taking place of, we're seeing a lot of different generation resources going from very large generating facilities where we're typically talking about larger coal plants, nuclear facilities are providing base load, to increasingly smaller plants that are doing either distributed generation or just a lot of small peaker plants that are now sort of substituting some of those peak loads. Do you see, or have we seen sort of in this conversation where size matters, or is it really just about opportunities of interest? I mean, even looking at some of these activity groups, we have wind turbines in Azerbaijan versus, some very large utilities across the world. So is there a differentiator between the size or types of industrial control systems for any of these groups, or is it really just focusing on opportunities of interest? These are utilities, you're doing a service for citizens, and therefore you may be a target regardless.
Yeah, also, I mean, I would say it's a bit of everything also, right? It depends on what is the final mission of the AG. So you can be a target regardless, but sometimes we may also see, smaller entities, smaller utilities being targeted because they may share a specific technology with a more interesting, let's say, target, and those could be used as a sort of, let's say, test bed for further attacks. So it really depends on the actual intent, which is probably the most difficult thing to assess in intel, the intent of the activity groups. So there is definitely, I wouldn't split in war like only war if you're a big one or a small one. Right. Definitely.
And I know it's also discussed in the sort of global threat perspective, but yes. Is there a conversation that you'd like to be able to provide on some of the activity based off of region? For example, any increase in the EU versus North America, or how would you sort of separate out any regional sort of differences across these groups?
Well, we have seen seen more activities in the US from, of course, everyone has a field of view bias, right? We have, of course, bigger visibility in the US. That's where we see more activities, but we have definitely seen, and as I mentioned before, some groups targeting European electric facilities. There is definitely a lot of action, if you wanna say so, in Asia Pacific, especially. And so we are really seeing across every region, we're seeing targeting in all three sectors, in all three segments. So there is not a region which I would say it's immune, or there has not been any targeted type of attack. But yeah, of course, you would see more reporting on different region depending on where you're. Biggest telemetry, but we have telemetry worldwide, so that's why we're being able to see also those activity across every geographical area, basically.
Awesome.
Okay, let's now go to, thanks Jason for wrapping the question up. Let's go to the transmission segment. So about here we have seen two groups, mainly Kamasite we have already talked about in the earlier section. And the other one we have observed attacking, carrying over intrusion towards transmission is Electrum, which many of you probably may know because it was responsible for the crash override malware that was used in the attack in December 2016 in Ukraine. And basically what happened there was that the adversary tailored the malware to de-energize transmission level substation by opening and closing numerous circuit breakers that were used in the delivery of power in the electric system, and they were ensuring operator, power line, and equipment safety, basically. And one of the main reasons of why this attack was quite important is because actually demonstrated a deep understanding of the transmission environment and industrial protocol that were in use, which enabled the adversary to customize the malware for that specific target. This means that in terms of resources and also in terms of intent, of motivation, there was like a lot of resources and a strong intent in targeting that specific environment, because the knowledge required was substantial. And so while this attack took place in Europe, of course, like talking about regionals, it may also be possible that for similar attack can occur in other parts of the world. This because, of course, those utilities, those target environment can share maybe in this specific case the protocol that was used. For example, the Electrum case we just talked about. The attack targeted the breaker operation controlled by ABB devices, which were following the IEC 61850 standard, and communication using a specific protocol. This protocol, they can basically, this attacker could attack any other utility that adheres to those standards. This is you should not take as a concern that okay, it was targeting Ukraine, then I'm not in Ukraine, I'm out, I'm immune from this. And the third segment is the distribution. Here in the current landscape, we have only one adversary actually has disrupted electric distribution operation. And this was the other attack in Ukraine, which took place in 2015, in which Kamasite actually enabled the operations. And this was important because it was the first widespread outage caused by a cyber attack. There was no previous knowledge before 2015 about any such thing. And contrary to in the Electrum case that we talked before, where the malware was tailored and there was ICS specific, the malware was ICS specific malware. In the 2015, actually, the adversary did not use any such thing. It just controlled the operations remotely via existing tools that were in the operation environment. So basically, they took control of the operation machine and they were just switching on and off breakers. And so this also shows that the such level of disruption can be reached also without of course, there is need for knowledge of the specific environment, but it's not ICS specific, like in the case of Electrum. So disruptive, in general, to wrap up, an electric power plant at any point through generation, transmission, distribution requires the adversary to have very fundamental understanding of the enterprise and the operation environment. Is not something that easy, of course. The equipment they use and how to operate, those are specialized type of equipment, of course. And adversary must spend extended period of time. They have to be in the target environment for quite a lot of time to learn the specificity of the systems in order to successfully deliver those type of attacks, which means, this is a good news for us, that we defenders, we have a lot of time and multiple points, multiple chances, multiple points of opportunity along this timeline to detect and potentially, hopefully, eliminate the access to the adversary, to disrupt their operation. And of course, this comes with the proper visibility. We can do this and eliminate at least reduce the type of threats. Next section. Now we are gonna, as we So before in the agenda, now we're gonna talk about three, let's say, classes, if you will, of let's say the threat landscape, three type of attacks and intrusions that are, of course, concerning independently, like the whole ICS environment, but also we've seen activities in electric environment. And let's start with ransomware, which the last year, last year has been pretty heavy, but the last years have been significant. There's been a significant increase in ransomware attack. We've all seen through the news that has been affecting ICS in general. Of course, the most famous case, the recent case in ICS was Colonial Pipeline, but it has been, of course, affecting also electric utilities and vendor as well. And almost all ransomware operators have now incorporated data theft techniques into their campaign, so they can further ransom demands. It's not just, we say, okay, if you have backup, there is no reason to worry. Now they say, okay, then now we're going to leak everything we got from you. So even if you have a backup, you may want to still pay us, because otherwise we leak your internal information. And just thinking between 2018 and 2020, 10% of ransomware attack that occurred on industrial related entities targeted electric utilities. And we have seen this number growing in 2021. Again, generally in ICS has been more targeted, but also in the electric sector. Just to give you one big case from 2020, if you may remember, was the Italian-based multinational energy company Enel Group, who experienced actually 2 ransomware attacks in just a few months. They were targeted by Ekans Group in June and Netwalker in October. And even though, as I said before, those attacks, did not impact the delivery of electric service, in the second case, the attacker leaked the data because the company refused to pay the ransom. So the first one was, there was no leak, it was just ransomware, the old, let's say, style. And also, the other thing I wanted to highlight here is that usually, when we talk about ransomware, we talk about, most of the time, cybercrime and financially motivated adversary. So one may think this is not a threat, it's not, it's financially motivated, it's not gonna affect, it's not ICS threat specific. But this should not instead make anyone lower their attention, because even though none of those ransomware attacks we have seen had any OT, let's say, awareness, was completely OT focused, they have been able to cause operation to halt, because the impact they have on the IT side of the network was huge. The amount of machine that had been taken offline was huge, that anyway the operation had to be altered. So this is another consideration to be made. And also about the data being stolen, why it's also important to think carefully about it, because adversary could also use this customer data, if you are a vendor or a manufacturer, to identify potential opportunities for third-party or supply chain compromise, or using data like schematics, network diagrams, or other internal documentation that can be sold to other adversaries that want to use this to identify targets for their operational gain. So both aspects are really crucial, really important to think about when we talk about ransomware. And to give you one of the cases we worked on focusing on electric in this year, in 2021, we responded to several. In this specific one, the adversary stayed undetected. This was targeting a US power company, and the adversary stayed undetected inside the network for over a month. So over a month time also for the defenders, for us to manage to be able to try to catch them, to see them. And during this month, they have performed credential harvesting, lateral movement, mapped network topology, and performed, of course, the data exfiltration we just talked about, before completing the operation, which was the actual ransomware attack, which it took itself about an hour. So a month to do everything, and then in just 1 hour, they launched the ransomware, and until it was detected, which was basically too late, because the compromise was big enough that the company had to halt operations, even though it was just the IT network. And in this case, like in many others, what made it easier for an adversary to have such an impact, to maximize the damage, was that flat, non-segmented network and the lack of multi-factor authentication on externally exposed resources and services, which would have prevented such incident. You will see more in some of the recommendations we will have at the end of this of the presentation. The second type of, let's say, attack of intrusions I want to talk to you about is, of course, supply chain. And when we talk about supply chain risk and intrusions, we need to think both about the software update type of risk and the potential abuse of remote access to our organizations. Therefore, there are many external players that we need to think about when assessing such risk. And for ICS in general, and again, electric in particular, OEM, the manufacturer, and third-party contractor often have remote access to critical parts of customer networks. That those could provide, of course, ingress via compromise or poorly secured direct network connection. And most of the times, if you think about the worrisome part is that most of the times those type of access are privileged type of connections because they are there to provide direct support, for example, or remote maintenance, and this could be greatly abused, right? And of course, compromising one vendor, compromising one manufacturer will also, the risk is that will give the adversary a multiplier effect, because compromising one means that they may have access to many utilities that are connected to this specific manufacturer or vendor. So they represent a big opportunity for the adversary. We've seen in the news, the effect of this supply chain attacks. And so, as we say, the use cases for remote access are different. We can also, Jason mentioned a bit at the beginning, but we can have from troubleshooting to during COVID, need to work remotely to check remotely the network. So there are definitely different type of risk that needs to be taken into account. But also the other case for supply chain risk is the software updates, and this is with the recent SolarWinds case as the most famous. For those of you who are not familiar, in December 2020, FireEye revealed the first details of this massive supply chain compromise campaign that impacted companies and governments all around the globe. And of course, this included electric utilities. Adversary basically compromised the IT management software, which is SolarWinds is IT management software. And then they were able to gain access to thousands of organizations that use SolarWinds by pushing a malicious update. So instead of, this is the other side of the supply chain type of risk that we need to consider. And we at Dragos actually have responded to numerous incidents where compromised version of SolarWinds were present in the ICS network of several companies. And we have identified at least 2 OEMs that were using compromised SolarWinds software across maintenance link, direct link into ICS networks, to include turbine control software and the like. And of course, adversary could have, in this case, easily leveraged this type of access to cause significant disruption. And again, I like to give you another use case from practical incident or discovery we had. This specifically was in April 2021. With Dragos, we discovered the compromise of a South Asian ICS provider who had significant links to electric industry customers, especially in Europe. And we could see from our telemetry that they had VPN tunnels to power generation companies in the US, in the UK, and other European countries. And so, again, as we said before, these are very cross-regional risks. A provider which is in South Asia enable access to a utility in Europe. It is when we start to take everything into account, the scenario, of course, it's much more complex. That's why it is important to be aware and to know how we can defend. But this we'll see later with Jason with some recommendation. Before moving to the next topic with Jason, do you have anything you want to add on the supply chain part, or else the mic is yours otherwise?
I was going to say just that I think a lot of utilities have been up front and center with this conversation on supply chain, particularly here in North America, having to deal with SIP 13 and sort of the responses from a procurement perspective, not necessarily all the different technical controls beyond that, but being able to have a supply chain management, risk management program in place and be able to provide that for future state of different procurements. And interesting to be able to reference SolarWinds before SIP 13 really became mandatory and enforceable here, how that would have impacted a lot of utilities. So this is obviously going to just continue to grow and bubble. And so obviously from a threat perspective, also knowing that this is a real risk that we need to be able to address. But yeah, let's go and talk about this last topic here. Since I started talking about connectivity, why don't I just end with talking about connectivity too? And so sort of the different flavor of some of these conversations now being about internet exposed assets. And this goes back to the connectivity that we're increasing that connectivity, but are we increasing that connectivity in a responsible fashion? And knowing that it's not necessarily the ICS systems themselves, but sort of the keys of the castle. If I'm thinking about sort of the crown jewels, I want to be able to have those strong perimeters in place. What are the things that are able to connect directly to the internet? And unfortunately, there's a lot of different reconnaissance that utilities will be able to find out. I should say, fortunately, that the tools exist, but unfortunately, they're going to find out some things in many cases where they have actual assets that are facing the internet that may not be as secure as they would like or think that they are. So in this case here, you can sort of see these different activity groups that are targeting, including Xenotime, where we saw sort of that destructive attack trying to go for health and human safety. Right. So now it's not just about lack of operations. It's really about conversations about what does it mean for our engineers and operators to return to a site where it's not going to be in a safe position. And it's a very different conversation. So those impacts are quite broad. And obviously, with what we've been dealing with in recent times, knowing that that connectivity has only been increasing. And unfortunately, with a lot of the ways that we had to be able to respond to it from an operational perspective, we may not have been able to get all the right security measures in place. And so you even had earlier last year, in July of 2020, both CISA here in the United States and NSA having a discussion about if you are doing anything in critical infrastructure, please make sure that you're aware of what your internet-facing devices are and lock them down. We know that adversaries like to go for these sort of castle keys, as they were, VPN access, any sort of asset that may be able to link into operations that has remote desktop protocol enabled. We've seen attacks that have leveraged those, destructive attacks that have led towards outages in the case of the Ukraine event, or again, in health and human safety for things such as Trisis. So understanding that not only are those threats real and they're happening, but also there's things that we can do to manage them to be able to help harden those systems and sort of build those in to, I guess, in the next slide. And so as we round out our conversation here, the recommendations that we'd like to be able to provide you all with. So these recommendations come not only from the conversations of threat activity groups and what it is that we're able to see, but also on the global services side, what it is that we're able to perform with our clients that go through regular activities with us, be it architecture reviews or other conversations about how secure is their OT network and their industrial control systems from sort of this outside looking in, but also the inside looking inside. Different perspectives. And so you can sort of see here just very 5 high-level conversations that every utility should have at this point based off of real threats and real things that we can do on standards and what we can do to really bolden and create a better cybersecurity architecture for our industrial control systems. And so the first one shouldn't come to any surprise for anybody, but access restrictions and account management. So a couple of things when folks first like to get into ICS, they want to be able to talk about, well, what are our assets, right? What are sort of the things that are on our network? But there also needs to be a conversation about, well, who are the people that are accessing these things? How are they accessing them? Have we put sort of a restrictive requirements in place so that it's operators only with regards to this least privilege of operations, things that may be a little bit more difficult, but you can build out the processes and the training around the workforce to support them, while also making sure that you're able to sort of decrease your overall attack surface over time. But attacks will happen. And it's really understanding at that course, what does it look like to respond to a really bad day? And a lot of that, unfortunately, takes this sort of Venn diagram of where our IT folks at, our OT folks, our engineers, our operators, the vendors, and being able to understand how it is that you would respond to those bad days. Having the response plan is one thing by itself. The other piece is just being able to test them, do tabletops. One of the things that I like to be able to tell people is don't introduce yourself the first time that you have an incident. You should be able to have sort of that culture in place that you know where those handoffs between all those different skill sets take place. If you have an IT incident response plan and you try to roll it into a plant or a facility, you're going to find it's going to be very difficult if you've not had a conversation with engineers and operators about what it means to have them operate that plant with the conversation on these are the things we're seeing in either the IT network or the OT network that you need to be aware of so they can do it safely and reliably. Same thing though, when we start to talk about what is the difference between that IT and the OT, understanding that segmentation is going to be your very first key, making sure that you have strong perimeters in place. And we've done a really good job sort of historically with doing this with physical security. We've done this sort of way back when we're talking about safety, right? And sort of putting perimeters in plans to keep things safe. Well, we need to do the same thing for our electronic networks and making sure that we don't have that same trust relationship internal to our ICS where it may be physically more dirty, but it should be from a sort of security-wise cleaner. We want to make sure that we're not having a lot of the different services and operations we see in IT sort of come into the OT network. And this is, again, one of the things where we're seeing a trend now towards more cloud connectivity, more connectivity in general to the industrial control system network, and keeping those things segmented, having a strong DMZ in place so you can manage those connections, understand why things are connecting back and forth, and then being able to have more restrictions overall, right? Making sure that you're only doing things that are needed for operations inside that OT network. Third parties, so as has been discussed in sort of the last very few slides of here, really a lot of things that we're seeing in the supply chain and making sure that the supply chain is not just about your vendors, but it's also going to be about your integrators. It's going to be about your consultants and contractors who come on site to help you out in certain situations. How are they connecting back to home base? What assets are they bringing on site? There are a lot of things that need to be considered now for supply chain. And I understand the pain here for sure, especially when we talk about utilities, where we have some utilities in the United States and North America and abroad that have been around for over 100 years. Those are a lot of contracts that have been written over that time period. And without exaggeration, when I walk into a utility and we talk about tens of thousands of contracts, that's a lot to put in place for supply chain. And that is an understandable pain point. But we've also now seen more and more evidence of what adversaries are doing in this space to sort of raise it up to a level of effort that may go in some cases beyond some of the things that you must comply with. And then lastly, but certainly not least, is visibility. I think even seeing these use cases where how long was the adversary sort of living off the land, undetected with free range of movement, being able to map out systems, understand from an OT network perspective what's taking place before launching an attack that could cause an outage, whether it be on the IT side or on the OT side, having that visibility is paramount. And obviously combined with things like the 100-day plan, focusing more on the OT where we haven't traditionally had a lot of visibility. And even in the cases where a lot of utilities first time come in and they say, I know I'm going to get a lot of good data in the OT network, and they want to be able to get sort of a sensor put in place there, understanding that you're first probably going to have to clean up some of the misconfiguration issues, some other aspects before you can start getting usable data from there. So understanding sort of the maturity model, as it were, of what it means to internalize that data, leverage that data, and then be able to demonstrate what that means for both operations and business perspectives while you're simultaneously helping out with the overall mission of detecting so you can then respond and recover. So I think I'll turn it back for any closing discussions. It looks like there were a couple of questions that sort of came in towards the end there. So maybe we should tackle through those and see what discussions we get from it.
Yes. Thank you, Jason. And thank you, everyone. Yeah, I think we have definitely time for a few questions. Let me see some. Okay, about the ransomware case study, if did the ransomware basically activity occurred just in the corporate environment? Yes, that specific case study was, and as I said, mostly ransomware has been targeting, doesn't have an ICS awareness from what we've observed. They're almost all, I would say, not almost, have been targeting the IT network. But the extent of the damage and the number of systems that have been crippled by the ransomware, it's so vast that basically most of the utilities have to halt operations, even though there was nothing affecting OT per se. So it is an IT threat with OT type of impact.
it's almost like splash damage, right? Like if there's a couple of things that every utility should understand in tabletop at this point. One is sort of the unintended IT malware. We first started with SIP with that, right? NERC SIP in North America was started with what happens when we're dealing with Configure or Slammer running into our control center. It wasn't OT specific, but it was still a nuisance and something that had to be dealt with. Now with ransomware, some of the use cases that folks needed to absolutely understand is how much are you dependent on IT corporate networks? What is your dependency on GIS, for example? Would you still be able to roll out trucks if you're had an outage during those cases? Even if it doesn't seem like it's part of OT, there's a lot of IT functionality that we've used for the business case that understanding that you should tabletop the complete lack of IT environment. And especially if you have like voice over IP phones and things of that nature, like get ready for being blasted back to the 1960s. And what does it look like to do? So to sit on the edge of our seats, not talking to corporate and understanding what's going back and forth without market perspectives, if you're in a market utility network or anything like that. And so just being able to understand that, even if it's not impacting the electronic security perimeter for things like NERC SIP, the fact that you could have a really bad day regardless of your ESP being just fine, everything else around you could be burning. And what would that mean for your operations?
Yep, absolutely. Another question we have. So as the pandemic made things worse, since more people are working from home, I guess the answer is a big yes. I probably can give you like this, the mic to you. Like you talked about this in the introduction, like the trend that we have seen in the amount of remote access, especially of course due to the pandemic, which was a legit reason. I mean, we see plenty of non-legit reason for asset being exposed to the internet, but this definitely is a legit one, which has to be done properly. So
yeah, we wrote a blog about this right when the pandemic started, because we started seeing a lot of different industrial organizations stop taking the planful approach that maybe remote access to certain facilities was going to come out in the next few years and the security controls would all be in place, to vendors releasing free versions of their remote access sort of software to help industrial organizations create remote access, which is great that it's free, but then all that planfulness almost went away. And so it became sort of this knee jerk of, well, we need it in ASAP. And there's obviously an operational understanding that needs to take place with that, but without the security necessarily that was in place in previous years. And so if we were to sort of chart out the remote access connections that most industrial organizations have gone through during the pandemic, it is just a ever increasing curve.
Thanks. Let's see, we have still time for a few more questions. Okay, about the is this being recorded? Would like okay, this is a more a logistic question. This is going to be on our website?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, we are recording it, and we'll send out the recording to everyone as soon as it's posted.
Perfect. Thank you.
I see two questions that are probably things that we can link together. And so I'll take an attempt at those. And it's with regards to transient cyber assets. For those who are familiar with NERC SIP language, for those outside of NERC SIP, since it's a global threat perspective, the idea of walking in with different electronic devices that you're connecting to your industrial control system network, either for maintenance or troubleshooting, or even to do security tasks like vulnerability assessments. And I will say that it is one of those more difficult things for a lot of organizations to manage. Especially now where we saw some sort of organizations say, you know what, they're now your take-home laptops because of the pandemic, and seeing things that may be dual homed, meaning they can go onto different networks at the same time, sort of providing this additional access point. And so absolutely, those things need to be managed. And I would say managed more than just policies, managed more than just saying that we're going to have a policy in place for our transient cyber assets, because these things, you're walking directly into some facilities that may otherwise have no connectivity, and you're providing sort of that initial footprint. And so from a security perspective, absolutely making sure that you're hardening those things to the best of your capability, that you're doing sort of all those really good cyber hygiene, as much as I hate using that phrase, tasks, to provide sort of the basics of security in place. So you can, again, we're looking for detection. Prevention is ideal, detection is a must. And detection without the ability to respond is going to be of very little value. So sort of make sure that you're building into the idea of being able to respond, but being able to detect is going to be a key point to your response characteristics.
Absolutely. Thanks. I see we may still have time for one or two. Okay, there is another logistic one. Presentation, so slides, I don't know if the slides are going to be sent out, but for sure you have access to the report, which is already been published on our website a while ago. So that basically the slides reflect everything, and the report, there is of course much more that we are able to cover in this short amount of time.
And that URL is from Linda up at the top of the chat. If folks want to scroll up there, or Linda, I don't know if we can put that in the chat directly now. There we go.
Perfect. There it is. Okay, let's see. Let's see if we manage to do one more, maybe.
Oh man, okay. I can take a stab at the DMZ discussion.
There are.
I love that. Yeah, I love the conversation.
There are many questions, which is good discussion. But let's take the one last, and then we wrap up.
Okay.
So
the DMZ piece is great. I'll sort of wrap on this one. There is actually a really good sort of voluntary guidance that came out of the NERC control systems working group way back, I think in like 2012, 2013, that talks about the different sort of firewall implementation you can have in place that allows you to just have that level 3.5 DMZ. But maybe if you want to get a little bit more robust, talk about inbound and outbound DMZs, where you're able to sort of get sort of the sitting traffic on either side. And that allows you to do a lot more characteristics and understanding and forensics of what a bad day may potentially look like, or even just be able to detect a lot earlier, because it's not just being flooded with a whole lot of inbound and outbound traffic. You can start seeing things, what's leaving sort of your ESP, electronic security perimeter, and what's coming in separately. So there's a lot of good other technologies you could use beyond just sort of DMZ construction, proxies. There's a whole host of other technologies that I don't think you need to reconfigure and necessarily have a level 3.75 DMZ, but definitely being able to have the additional controls to look at your DMZ with a lot more detail would be very useful.
Definitely. Well, thanks a lot, Jason. I think we are to the minute. Thank you everyone for attending. We hope it was useful, an hour well spent. For sure, you can reach out to us. You know where to find us, and please have a look at the report. There is much more, and there is more details of what we were able to just cover in this hour, of course. And thank you very much for attending.
Thank you all.